This is our third fairy tale seminar, and today I'm going to pay special attention to a work by Erich Neumann, an interpretation of an ancient fairy tale from the 2nd century Common Era called Amor and Psyche. Let me just review briefly where we've been so far in these fairy tale seminars. At the beginning, I set out to try to account for why Jungians study fairy tales, how they interpret fairy tales, and how they use fairy tales. So let me just say a brief word about that. And remind you of the first two seminars. In the first one, I introduced the works of Mary Louise von Franz, who is generally regarded as the preeminent doyen of fairy tale interpretation in the Jungian world. She was very close to Carl Jung, worked with Jung for the last 30 years of Jung's life, side by side with him, working on alchemy. And after Jung's death in 1961, she concentrated mightily on interpretation of fairy tales. There are 5 or 6 books by her on the interpretation of fairy tales from various different perspectives and themes. And the first one, called the Psychology of Fairy Tales, or Introduction to the Interpretation of Fairy Tales, lays out her methodology, her general ideas about what we can find in fairy tales. And I think that she has established more or less the consensus, or her views have become the consensus in the Jungian field as to why Jungians study fairy tales and interpret fairy tales. There are many reasons, but basically it comes down to the notion that fairy tales contain a fairly pure, depiction of the archetypal world, archetypal images and archetypal processes, so that by looking deeply and carefully into the structure of fairy tales, their themes, their processes, we get an idea of how things look in the collective unconscious and in the world of the archetypes. Now, the archetypes, as we Jungians speak of them and think about them, form the basic layer, the basic and common layer of the human psyche. And so what we can find and describe and discuss in fairy tales applies cross-culturally to all peoples, all times, all places. And so the knowledge about these themes helps Jungian analysts work with people from other cultures, understand psychology, human psychology, in a general sense, beyond cultural forms and patterns, and provides a kind of ready-made insight into the workings of the psyche, no matter where a person grows up or which culture they come from. And in our increasingly multicultural world, this can be a great advantage for analysts who are working with people from many different parts of the world, living in their cities and coming to them for psychotherapy and analysis. So why do Jungians study fairy tales? Because it offers us a glimpse into the archetypal world. How do we interpret fairy tales? Again, I laid out for you von Franz's methodology, its various steps. I will review them again today, but there is a systematic way of going about interpreting fairy tales that allows us to see how they relate to each other, how they relate to the collective psyche, the individual psyche. And the method of fairy tale interpretation that von Franz describes is pretty much generally used by Jungian analysts throughout the world if they set out to interpret fairy tales and write about them. And we'll see that Erich Neumann, in his work, um, follows more or less a similar uh, pattern of interpretation to what von Franz describes, although he wrote his book before von Franz really set out to put a great deal of effort into the interpretation of fairy tales. And how do Jungians use fairy tales? Well, in many different ways. And in the next two seminars, John Hill will describe his, which I believe to be quite unique, use of fairy tales in psychodrama, in seminars and workshops in which he allows people to engage in the fairy tale world and bring their own personal perspectives and feelings and intuitions to bear, and to expose their own, some of their own unconscious material through this work with fairy tales. Von Franz says a very interesting thing in her book on the interpretation of fairy tales, and that is, she, I suppose she's speaking for herself, but I think many others would agree, we find it very satisfying to interpret fairy tales. It's fun. We get something from it. There's a pleasure involved in unraveling the meaning and seeing into the deeper structures of the fairy tale world. And so you could also say another reason for engaging with fairy tales has to do with pleasure, just for the fun of it and the interest that it holds for us. Today I'm going to introduce Erich Neumann. I'm not going to say too much about his life and general works. He wrote a great many books and articles in the course of his short life. He was born in 1905 and died not in 1990. That's a mistake on the screen. It should be 1960. Sorry about that. It was a slip. Something got in there somehow. He lived so only to the age of 55, and he was born in Berlin. He was of Jewish background, was educated in Germany, first as a philosopher, had a PhD in philosophy, and then he decided to become a psychiatrist and went and got a medical degree. And in 1933, married, left Germany, not only because that was the year that Hitler came into power in Germany, but because he and his wife had chosen to move to Palestine, and for other reasons, ideological reasons and religious reasons. But they first spent a year in Zurich working with Jung. So 1933 to 1934, Neumann was with Jung in Zurich, deeply immersed in his own analysis and his work with Jung. And then from there, he went to Tel Aviv, and he lived the rest of his life there in what was then Palestine and later became Israel. He began writing quite early in his professional life, already before he was an analyst. He wrote several studies, psychological studies, philosophical studies. Some of them are still unpublished. But he really started going after the Second World War. I think during the war he was quite isolated in Tel Aviv, and spent a lot of time studying classical materials, especially Greek mythology and other ancient mythologies, Egyptian, Babylonian, and so on. And after the war, published what is come to be one of the great Jungian classics, The Origins and History of Consciousness, in which he outlines stages of psychological development that correspond to stages of cultural development from the matriarchal world to the patriarchal world to the modern world. And in that book, he really laid the foundations for the rest of his work. He was a stage theorist. He was very interested in stages of development. And we'll see in his interpretation of the story of Amor and Psyche how he uses his understanding of stages of psychological development to interpret this fairy tale. After the war, he also began participating regularly in the Eranos conferences in Ascona, Switzerland, every August. Eranos Tagung would take place in August annually. Jung was always present until his old age interrupted his participation. But Neumann, until the end of his life, from 1948, I believe, until 1959, 60, every year gave an important lecture at Eranos. And these were then combined in several volumes, collected papers and essays. And also out of his experience at Eranos came his other great book that he's so famous for, The Great Mother, that was instigated by Olga Frebe-Kapitan, who was the founder of Eranos, and she had been collecting images of goddesses and mythological feminine figures for a period of time. She handed these over to Neumann and asked him if he would like to write an essay about them. And he started and couldn't stop, and he wrote a very big book called The Great Mother. It's a great book, and it's a major contribution to the Jungian literature. Those were his two great books, and besides those, he wrote many other essays and studies. In addition, he had an extensive correspondence with Jung, writing letters back and forth, interrupted by the war when the mail was not going through in and out of Switzerland. And that correspondence has not seen the light of day yet, but is now in preparation at Princeton University Press and will be published early next year. And in conjunction with that auspicious event, finally, the Jung-Neumann letters will be published. People have been waiting to see these for a long time. There will be a conference held in Tel Aviv, in Neumann's home city, celebrating the publication and celebrating his life and his work. That will be in April, around April 20th. If you're interested to go, you're certainly welcome to attend, and you can get information through the Asheville Jung Center for how to register and go ahead and book your flights and so on to Israel in April. Now, what I want to look at today is Neumann's interpretation of the story Amor and Psyche. In the first session, the first seminar, we looked at a Grimm's fairy tale, The White Snake, and I applied von Franz's methodology to the interpretation of that. And we'll see some parallel motifs in this story, Amor and Psyche, to the one that I discussed there, The White Snake, the Grimm's fairy tale. In the second seminar, we looked at Jung's interpretation of a fairy tale called The Spirit in the Bottle, in which he discusses the figure Mercurius and the release of Mercurius from his captivity at the base of a tree, of an oak tree in the woods, fairy tale, and the dangerous implications of that release, that Mercurius, uncontained in the world, is ambiguous, to say the least, happening that Jung dates to roughly the 17th century, the beginning of the scientific revolution and the end of the religious consensus in the Western world. and this release of energy and interest in nature that produced modern science has positive results, certainly in many aspects, but also destructive and negative results, as we all know from recent studies of in ecology and what's going on in the world of nature as a result of humankind's vast and perhaps excessive domination of the natural world. Not to mention political eruptions that have happened in the last several centuries that Jung also finds attributable perhaps to the spirit Mercurius, or Wotan, as he relates Mercurius to the Germanic war god Wotan. Now in this seminar, we'll look at Neumann's interpretation of a very old story. I'm calling it a fairy tale, although it's not a usual fairy tale in several senses. First of all, names are mentioned in the fairy tale. Most fairy tales that you read in fairy tale collections, the Grimms and so on, don't offer you any names. There was a woodcutter and his son, for instance, in the story about the spirit in the bottle, or in the White Snake, there was a servant and a king and a queen and a princess, but they don't have any particular names, and they are so impersonal that von Franz would say this is an indication of their collective nature. They don't have specific names. You can't pin them down to a particular place, a particular mythology, a particular time. They simply exist in another world, in the fairy tale world. Now this story, Amor and Psyche, which Neumann takes from a book called The Golden Ass of Apuleius. Apuleius was a writer in the 2nd century. And this is an episode in that work. It's considered one of the oldest novels in the history of the world, certainly in the West, dating from the 2nd century Common Era. And the story of Amor and Psyche is told within the context of that novel to a young girl who's been captured by some bandits and is being held in a cave. And an old woman in the cave takes pity on her. She's with the bandits. She's their cook or their helper. But she takes pity on this young woman, and she tells her an encouraging story. And the story is the story of Amor and Psyche. Hillman says about this story, Jungians can't leave it alone. There have been many, at least a half dozen that I know of, attempts by Jungians to interpret this story or to make use of it for their own purposes. And Neumann's is probably the most famous of the interpretations and the most extensive. Von Franz offers an interpretation of the whole novel of The Golden Ass of Apuleius. And within that work, interpretation, she spends a couple of chapters on Amor and Psyche. And she takes a different view of the story because she puts it in the context of the novel and sees it as a tale that has to do with Apuleius, who is about to be initiated into the mysteries of the cult of Isis, and that this is a kind of preliminary, preparatory version of what he will experience in those mysteries. Neumann breaks the story out and treats it as a separate fairy tale entity in its own right. And he interprets it as such. Now, what he does with it, we will look at in just a moment. What he does with it is to interpret it as the story of the development psychological development of the feminine in 5 stages. And I will outline those stages for you as we go through the story. First, I want to just remind you of von Franz's method, because we will be holding this in the background as we look at Neumann's account. First of all, she says, take a note of time and place. Where is the story happening, and in what place? Is it in the forest? Is it in a city? Is it in the country? Where is it? So on. And then look at the dramatis personae. And she says, I recommend counting the number of people at the beginning and the end. Now, with regard to Amor and Psyche, it's very interesting to notice the difference of in the cast of characters between the beginning and the end. As we'll see, at the beginning, they're pretty much all human characters. At the end, Psyche is the only human character, and there are a lot of mythological characters around her. So there's a significant change in dramatis personae between the beginning and the end of the story. And then there's the naming of the problem. What is the problem? The fairy tale starts out with a situation, and then very quickly states a difficulty, a problem, or a problem develops. And we'll see that that is the case with Amor and Psyche. There is a problem right at the beginning of the story, and that's the problem that will have to be solved in the end. And we'll see how it evolves. And then there's the peripeteia, she says. This is the ups and downs of the story. And generally you get to a climax or a decisive point where either the whole thing develops into a tragedy or it comes out right. Then there's a lysis or sometimes a catastrophe. And we'll see that this applies very clearly to the story of Amor and Psyche. There are many ups and downs. There are trials and tribulations. There are moments of discouragement and moments of triumph. And then there is a climax, and it does come out right, and there's a lysis, which is the marriage of Amor and Psyche on Olympus. Now, she says you should remember especially to count the characters and to notice the number symbolism in the part it plays. I don't think number symbolism plays such a big role in this, but we will notice that it does occasionally. And then von Franz says, we amplify the characters. We look at the comparative material, and Neumann does a whole lot of this. He amplifies in his study all of the characters, all of the situations, but he amplifies them not by reference to other fairy tales as such, but rather by connecting them to mythological themes and motifs that were common to the period in which the story appears, that is Greek mythology, and its background. Scholars have determined that the story of Amor and Psyche is extremely ancient, goes far beyond the 2nd century of our common era. It goes into Babylonian times and Egyptian mythology. So there are deep roots of this tale in previous centuries and the mythologies of various cultures. Neumann refers to some of those in the appendix to his book. Von Franz makes a lot of them, does a terrific job of amplification in her work on this story. And so if you want to really go deeply into what they have to say, I would refer you to their work. I'm not going to do too much of that today with you. And then there are 2 more steps, she says, constructing a context. And the context for this story partly is the period in which the story appears, that is, in Apuleius' time. And von Franz reads it very much that way. Neumann does not so much. He takes it on a more archetypal level, I would say, and applies it to the present time and to present circumstances. So his context is really his own historical period, and he is looking at his period through the lens of the fairy tale, so to speak, and has very interesting things to say about what's going on in modern culture based on themes that he finds in the fairy tale. And then comes the last essential step, says von Franz, which is the interpretation itself. That's the task of translating the story into psychological language. And we'll see that Neumann does this throughout his work. He's constantly translating from mythology into psychological language, and language especially of individuation, psychological individuation, and development. Now, there are many episodes in the tale of Amor and Psyche, and I'm just going to run through it quickly. Many of you have probably read this story or are familiar with it, but I'm going to give a brief account and base this on what I find to be roughly 10 episodes within the story. We'll see that Neumann consolidates these 10 into 5 major sections of the story. But let me just go through these and remind you again what the story is. It begins in a once upon a time fashion, so that gives us the hint that it is a fairy tale. It takes place once upon a time. It doesn't tell us where the country is, but it does say that there was a beautiful princess, and she was one of 3 daughters of a king and a queen. The king and queen aren't very important figures in this story. They don't make an appearance, they don't say anything. They're simply background figures. But there is a king and a queen, so both genders are represented, and 3 princesses, and the youngest of the 3 is named Psyche, and she's the most beautiful woman in the whole world. She's breathtakingly beautiful, and so beautiful that she can't get married. Men are afraid to approach her, and she even becomes a cult figure. Small temples are erected in her honor. People start worshiping her, and she's put on a pedestal. And this causes great suffering for a couple of reasons. One is that she can't make contact with the human world. She's put too far above it because of her great beauty, so she's isolated, can't be touched, can't be approached. She's out of relationship. And the other problem, and now the problems begin to appear, is that the great goddess Aphrodite gets very angry. Now, Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty, feminine beauty especially, the goddess of love, the goddess of procreation, sexuality. And she gets very angry at what's going on down beneath her on Earth in the human world. She lives in the mythological world, but she can see very well what's going on. And her temples are being abandoned. She isn't receiving sacrifices anymore. And instead, the throngs are going to her rival, the new Aphrodite, as she's called, Psyche. So Aphrodite gets very angry, and we could say that there's a kind of secularization afoot. The goddess is being abandoned, she doesn't like it, and she is going to make an intervention to stop this nonsense. So she pronounces a curse on Psyche, and she calls her young son Eros into her presence. Now, Eros is her child. In the story, Zeus is the father, Aphrodite is the mother, and Eros is their offspring. And Eros has the function of instilling blind, passionate love into human beings or to gods and goddesses. Everybody is afraid of Eros because his arrows, if they hit you, drive you mad to irrationality. You do crazy things. And so he's a very dangerous figure on the one hand. On the other hand, he is the god of romantic love, and she sends Eros on a mission. She tells her son what the problem is, and she gives him a very sensual kiss on the mouth as she dispatches him on his mission. Neumann makes quite a thing of that kiss, by the way. There's a kind of incestuous relationship between mother and son. And his mission is to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest, least attractive man in the world. And that will take care of her once she gets involved with some ugly, misshapen, old codger or whatever, bad specimen of the male gender. She will fall off her pedestal, people will stop worshiping her, and Aphrodite's temples will be restored. So that's Aphrodite's plan. In the meantime, Psyche's parents have sent a delegation to Apollo to ask for an oracle and what can be done about this situation, because they can't marry their daughter off. And she's getting older, and they're getting worried. The delegation comes back with an oracle from Apollo that is more or less a curse of death. Apollo says that she has to marry death. She has to be, in other words, she has to be killed. She has to be thrown to her death. And so the people in the village take Psyche out to a cliff, and there's a procession that goes out. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. Procession goes out mourning and grieving her death. They come to the edge of the cliff, and in a ritual fashion, they push her over the edge, and she goes falling down, supposedly to her death. But something surprising happens. The winds pick her up and gently set her down to the ground. And this is at the behest of Eros, because Eros, on his mission, has gotten a glimpse of Psyche, and he has fallen in love with her. Most beautiful woman in the world, and he decides that instead of carrying out his mission, he's going to save Psyche and install her in the most beautiful palace imaginable at the base of this cliff. So Psyche's feet are put down in the ground, and she looks around, and she's in a lovely palatial mansion. There are servants everywhere, invisible servants. They sing to her, they bring her food, they take care of everything. And she, in her astonishment, begins to enjoy it, and she eventually has a good meal and drinks some wine and goes to sleep in her bed. And in the night and in the dark, Eros comes, and the text says he makes her his bride. In the morning, or before the morning dawn, he leaves. Psyche is surprised by all this, doesn't really know what's going on. It's a little bit scary, but it's better than having been crushed on the rocks, and she's in a very nice place. And night after night, this is repeated. Eros, her husband, comes to her in the night, in the dark, visits her, spends the night with her. Before the dawn breaks, he leaves. And eventually, she settles down and begins to enjoy this. She even gets pregnant. Now, the sisters, her two sisters, are grieving her death. And they come to the edge of the cliff at one point, and they begin weeping and wailing and calling out their lamentations. And Psyche hears them. And that night she says to her husband Eros, you know, my sisters are calling out to me there. Maybe I should go and tell them I'm okay. And Eros says, don't ever go there. Don't talk to them. It's very dangerous. So at first, Psyche doesn't do this, but they keep coming to the edge of the cliff day after day, grieving, weeping and wailing. And finally, Psyche persuades her husband to allow her to bring the sisters down into her beautiful palace and show them around, show them that she's okay and they can get over their grieving. So this happens. The sisters are brought down by the winds, by the west wind, just as Psyche was, and they're put carefully down on the ground, and they look around and they say, my goodness, what is this? And then Psyche appears, and she offers them a very nice lunch, and the invisible servants everywhere, and they begin looking around and thinking, boy, she's got it pretty good here. And they start asking about her husband. Well, who is your husband? Who's providing all this? And Psyche makes up a story that he's a hunter and he's gone in the daytime, he comes at night, and they buy it at first. So then they go away, and then they start talking to each other, and they become very envious of her. And they complain. They say, you know, our parents married us off to these terrible old kings. These kings don't really pay any attention to us. We have to serve them. They're old, they're boring. We live a terrible life. Look what she's got. And this envy starts eating them alive. And they plot to destroy Psyche's happiness. This worm of envy is eating away at their hearts and souls. And so they come one day, Psyche receives them again, and they, in the meantime, have come up with the idea that they're going to ask her, they're going to tell her, because they found out somehow that through Psyche's has changed her story a couple of times about her husband. They discovered that she doesn't really know what her husband looks like. And they're going to plant a doubt in her mind and tell her that her husband really is an ugly dragon, a serpent, and that people have seen this serpent coming into the valley in the evening and leaving in the morning, and that she's actually, and that the serpent is waiting for her to have her baby, and then it's going to devour them both, that he's really an evil monster. And that what Psyche should do is light a lamp in the night, take a knife, and when she sees his head, cut his head off with a knife, decapitate him, kill him. And they leave, having planted this doubt in Psyche's mind. Now, Psyche oddly trusts them, and Eros has told her clearly, don't ever ask to look at me. Don't, it's dangerous. It will be the end of our relationship if you see me. Terrible things will happen. And this, plus the message of the sisters, creates great doubt in Psyche's mind. And this doubt grows, and she becomes very fearful. And so one night she prepares to do what the sisters have said. She takes a knife with her, she takes a lamp with her, and in the night, while Eros is asleep, she leaves the bed, lights her lamp, and takes a look at her husband. Well, the surprise is great because she doesn't see a dragon or a monster at all. She sees the most beautiful man she's ever seen in her entire life, and she falls in love with him. This is what Neumann calls a second defloration. She was first deflowered by Eros in the dark, and now her heart is deflowered when she actually sees her husband in a personal way as an individual, becomes an individual relationship. For the first time, she actually sees him. And she is so fascinated by him that she doesn't pay enough attention to her lamp, and the oil from the lamp falls out and onto Eros's shoulder and burns him. A terrible burn on his shoulder. He wakes up and he sees what has happened, and he immediately says, well, I have to leave. Our marriage is over. Our relationship is over. This is a catastrophe. Why did you do this? and he takes wing and he flies away. And she grabs hold of him and hangs on for dear life. And he carries her up out of the valley and into another area, and where she finally has to let go while he flies off, and she falls to the ground. Fallen to the ground, pregnant, she's at a loss, she's betrayed, she's abandoned, she's without orientation. She comes to a stream and decides to kill herself. And she walks into the stream, and as she enters the stream, she hears the pipes of Pan. Pan is sitting on the edge of the stream with his girlfriend, Echo, and he's playing the pipes and teaching her how to play the pipes, and they're having a nice time, enjoying the day. And he intervenes and interrupts Psyche's suicide attempt and gives her advice. He says, look, you know, probably your husband loves you. Why don't you just set out on a journey, go to Aphrodite, his mother, and tell her what has happened and win him back. You can win him back. I'm sure you can do it. Well, this gives Psyche some ideas and thoughts. So first she goes to the temple of Demeter and she asks for help. Demeter refuses because she's afraid of Eros. Same thing with Hera. She goes to Hera's temple. Hera refuses. She's afraid of Eros's arrows. You know, if they cross Aphrodite, they know they're going to be in trouble. And something terrible will happen to them. So Psyche's really left on her own. And so she decides to go to the temple of Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is totally enraged with her. Aphrodite is the worst mother-in-law you can imagine. She becomes a witch. And she wants to get rid of Psyche once and for all. So she gives her these terrible trials. There will be 4 trials. There will be 4 tests that Psyche has to overcome. And here we have the trials and tests of the heroine. We saw that in the White Snake there were similar trials. There were 3 trials in that story. In this one there are 4. And we'll see what Neumann says about that. The first trial is to sort the seeds. This is very similar to the white ant story. Aphrodite throws a bunch of seeds on the ground and says, pick them up. If they aren't picked up by morning, you know, you're toast. You'll be out of here. So again, like in the white snake story, helpful ants arrive in the night and they put the seeds all together, carefully sorted, so that by morning when Aphrodite comes back, she sees, oh my goodness, she's done it. Doesn't understand, but probably intuits, knows that the ants have helped. Those terrible ants didn't think of that. So she gives her another task. This time, the task is to gather the golden wool of rams that live high up in the mountains. And they, while they're in the middle of the day, they're out feeding and running around. They have this golden fleece, and the fleece, some of the fleece is left on bushes and trees as they pass through. And her job is to go and collect these golden fleece and bring them back to Aphrodite. Now, these are very dangerous animals. They're animals of the sun. They're solar animals. And if you approach them, they will, in the middle of the day especially, they will kill you. They will attack you. They hate strangers. Here, Psyche is given a helpful hint by a reed. A reed, a piece of vegetation, speaks to her and says, look, don't go there during the middle of the day. That's when they're really all worked up and they're very aggressive. Go there in the evening. They settle down, they've eaten, they're a little calmer. And then they won't mind if you come quietly gather some of the fleece from the bushes. So Psyche does that, and she's successful, and she comes back with the offering to Aphrodite. Again, Aphrodite is not satisfied. She gives her a third test, and this one is to climb to the mountain's highest summit and to fetch waters that spring from a a well. This is a very dangerous journey through the mountains, and there are passages that are almost impossible to go through, and the waters of such a wild, stormy nature that it can't be contained in containers, and it's an impossible task. But Psyche sets out, and on the way, a helpful eagle comes. An eagle of Zeus comes along, takes pity on her, says, give me your container. I'll go fetch the water for you." And the eagle knows how to make his way through these dangerous territories and is successful, brings the water back, gives it to Psyche. She takes it to Aphrodite. Aphrodite is astonished that she has been able to do all of these things and gives her one more task. Now, usually fairy tales end with 3 tasks, that's enough. This is a 4th task. Neumann comments on this. The number 4 indicates wholeness, and this is the task that will make or break Psyche. She has to go on a journey to Hades, to the house of Persephone, who lives with Hades in the underworld. And she has to ask for the gift of divine beauty and bring it back in a little sealed box. Aphrodite says, I'm getting older. I need this special cream and ointment that Persephone has. Persephone lives in a state of perpetual beauty, never aging. In the underworld, you don't get older. And so this is a perfect cosmetic for Aphrodite, who's feeling her age a little bit, especially in relation to Psyche, I think, because she's now the mother-in-law. Psyche's going to make her a grandmother. She complains about that to Eros, extensively, that how could you do this to me? I'm not a grandmother. You're making me into a grandmother. I'm a goddess of beauty. What is this? What's going on? So she's feeling her age a bit, and she's envious and jealous of Psyche. She thinks she'll get rid of Psyche this way. Psyche won't be able to get to the underworld. She will, or if she does, she'll stay there. She'll be executed in this fashion. So Psyche sets out, and this time she gets helpful advice again from a tower. A tower speaks to her and tells her exactly how to go into the underworld. You have to take 2 coins, and you have to put them, one going in and one coming out, give them to the boatman, to Kerberos, the dog. And when you're down there, don't listen to the pitiful calls of people in the river asking for help. Harden yourself. Don't let pity overtake you. If you do, you'll never come back. So Psyche takes this good advice, goes to Hades, is successful, gets what she has been sent for, and starts back. And she gets out of the underworld, comes back on Earth, and she sits down to take a little rest, and she thinks to herself, oh my goodness, you know what I have in this box? This is the greatest cosmetic in the world. I think I should just take a little bit. I could be getting older too. Maybe Eros won't like me so much. If I could just put this cosmetic on me, I will have immortal, youthful beauty. So she opens the box, and instead of cosmetics in the box, sleep comes out and puts her to sleep. It's the sleep of death. It's a death sleep. So she is completely knocked out. She's unconscious. And in this state, Eros, who's been following the story, and he's now recovered from his wounds, sees her, and he finally acts. He takes pity, he comes down, he intervenes, he entreats Zeus to help him, and Zeus agrees, and so he can revive Psyche, and he brings her up to Olympus and introduces her to Zeus. Now, Zeus loves pretty girls, and he's famous for it, and he looks at Psyche, And he looks at Eros and he thinks, well, that's a beautiful couple. And but he knows that Eros has not grown up enough to be a husband and a man. So he says, I will, I will marry you. I will allow you to be married if you agree, Eros, to be a husband um, to Psyche and change your ways. And and he speaks to Aphrodite, and you have to become a good mother-in-law. So he kind of lays down the law on Olympus. And of course, they all have to obey Zeus. And so then there's the famous wedding on Olympus, and Psyche is granted immortality as well. When she marries Eros, she becomes a goddess, so she can stay on Olympus, and she gives birth to a girl, a daughter, who in the text says in human language is called pleasure. Now that's the story of Amor and Psyche. It's a wonderful ending. It's a comedy in a sense that it ends well. It's not a tragedy. And you can see many fairy tale elements in there, all of which are discussed in detail by Neumann. Now, Neumann divides the tale into 5 parts. He says there's an introduction, that's a statement of place and the problem. That would be the first part of the tale. Then there's the marriage of death. And he's going to comment on this marriage of death. He does quite a lot of amplification of what it means to marry death in terms of psychological development of the feminine. And then there's the third division of this, that's the act, the unconscious union, the union with Eros and Psyche in the dark, then their separation, and then there's the change from the passive maiden Psyche into a very active Amazon-like woman, actually. Psyche becomes very active after her giving up her suicide attempt. She acts decisively. She does everything that is required of her. She becomes a heroine. And then there's the 5th part, the happy ending, which is the marriage and the birth of the child. So those are the 5 divisions that Neumann creates for the story. And then he begins his interpretation. So in the introduction, he says there's a problem of a girl too beautiful. Aphrodite, the mother goddess, is jealous. This is a new Aphrodite. And it's a kind of incarnation of a goddess on earth. There's a movement toward incarnation of the goddess in the human, and a movement at the end of deification of the human into the goddess. So it's a double movement in this story. Now, von Franz has quite a lot to say about this. She says that Psyche is actually also a goddess, and within the Great Mother configuration, which is Aphrodite in ancient times was a Great Mother goddess, there is a dispute within the archetype that one part of it wants to become humanized and one part of it doesn't. So that the Psyche part becomes Aphrodite on earth, the Aphrodite part wants to stay in the other world, in the archetypal world. And this is an internal dispute within the archetype, that there's a conflict within the archetypal structure itself. So that's von Franz. Neumann touches on that, but doesn't dwell on it. And then he speaks of this prologue in heaven, Aphrodite's plan for revenge, Eros to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest man, and Apollo's oracle that Psyche must marry death. That's the introduction. Now here's a picture by some painter of the whole country coming around clamoring to worship the beautiful Psyche, and Aphrodite's temples being abandoned. Now this theme of death and the maiden is where Neumann really starts his interpretation. He says the marriage of death, that within the matriarchal psychology, the matriarchal world, every marriage is death. Every marriage is seen as a rape of Hades and a loss of a daughter. So he's making reference to a Greek myth where Hades erupts out of the underworld, seizes Persephone, takes her to be his bride in the underworld, and separates her from her mother Demeter. And this separation from the mother and going off with a man within the context of matriarchal psychology is seen as a violence, a loss, and something to be mourned. It's like a death. Marriage of death, or marriage as death, belongs to the feminine psyche, Neumann says. Marriage means separation, a step in individuation from childhood to adulthood. And he points out that Psyche very readily accepts her fate. When she's told that she has to marry death and jump off the cliff, she doesn't fight it at all. She accepts it with a very calm spirit. She goes into her marriage, so to speak, not knowing it's even going to be a marriage. She thinks it's a death. Goes into this separation from her parents and her family with a very positive attitude. So it's like she's taking the step out of the matriarchal psychology, at least one step out, and that's the first stage of the individuation of the feminine, according to Neumann. Here you see the procession to death. It's a very organized ritual process. There's Psyche in the middle. They're strewing beautiful flowers on the ground, and they're taking her to her marriage. And then there is what Neumann calls the act, and this is Psyche in the paradise of Eros. And there's a strong prohibition. It's a taboo to knowing. You aren't supposed to know. In this paradise of Eros, there is containment and there is pleasure in the dark. It has to stay dark. It has to stay unconscious. And like the paradise in the Bible, there's a snake in paradise. Now, the snake is referenced by the sisters, who say that Psyche is married to a snake, and she believes them at first, till she sees better. But the sisters are the snake in paradise. They're the ones who disrupt the paradisal state. Neumann says something very interesting about the sisters. He says that they are really, they stem from Psyche's unconscious. They're shadow parts of her unconscious that are in the service of individuation, because they create a doubt. And that doubt will lead to her breaking the taboo. If this had not happened, if she had just stayed in this paradisal state, there would be no development. She would just like Adam and Eve staying in paradise, there would be no history. We wouldn't be, they would be in paradise eternally. And so this breaking of the taboo, lighting the lamp, becoming conscious, is instigated by these shadow sisters, these sinister thoughts, these doubting thoughts that break the taboo that Eros has laid down. And then there's punishment, just as there is in the Garden of Eden. There's separation. The punishment is this has to end. You're pushed out of the garden, the separation from the beloved Eros, the husband, and expulsion from paradise. And this is the most important act, according to Neumann, that, or one of the most important acts that Psyche does in the whole story, is to break this taboo, because in breaking the taboo, she brings consciousness, she brings light, and she brings the possibility for human development. So that's the second step. There you see the embrace in the dark, a beautiful sculpture that you, if you ever go to Paris and go to the Louvre, you'll see that sculpture there. Here is Eros taking leave at dawn. Psyche is sleeping. He's getting out of the bed with his wings, you can see. Here is Psyche entertaining the sisters. The envious sisters come down. And now the meaning of the sisters is further amplified by Neumann in an interesting way. He says the sisters symbolize, quote, the slavery of the feminine in the patriarchate. You know, they have been sold off to these kings, and they're enslaved to the kings. So they're living within the patriarchal world as female slaves. This is the unhappy marriage situation in the patriarchy. They're married to old kings and in their service. And their rage represents the ancient conflict between matriarchal and patriarchal psychologies, Neumann says. It's a hatred of matriarchal for patriarchal powers. See, the patriarchal powers have got everything. They insist on their way, and the feminine element has to follow along and obey. And so there is naturally a rage that builds up against the patriarchy. Now, the sister, Neumann says, are Psyche's shadow, and they instigate movement out of bondage to independence. And this movement to independence, as painful as it is an absolutely necessary step in Psyche's individuation, in the individuation of the feminine, Neumann would say. And that's as true today as it was then, that this step out of bondage to an unconscious situation or patriarchal marriage, a step to independence is absolutely necessary in the development of the woman. So he sees these terrible sisters as rather positive figures, actually, in the service of individuation. Here's Eros saying, don't look, that's the taboo. And there's the sputtering lamp, nice painting of Psyche gazing on Eros. The taboo broken, Psyche sees, and this leads to transformation, also from victim to active, loving woman. And this is the hinge point that Neumann emphasizes so much, that as long as she's in the dark, it looks like it's paradise, but she's really a victim of forces beyond her control. She's pushed over the cliff, she's carried down by the winds, she's kept in the dark. So she is passive and she's a victim of a situation, as nice as it is, the golden cage. But now she's taking the step to active, loving woman. When she sees Eros, the text says she falls in love with him. Well, she couldn't very well be in love with him before, although she enjoyed the pleasures of the place and so on. He's a nice lover and beautiful setting. But for the first time, she actually falls in love with him. She sees Eros and falls in love with love, Neumann says. In other words, she has the experience of love for the first time. And this is an inner experience, Neumann says, and it's beyond the boy who is in front of her. If you read the story, Eros really is very boyish. I mean, he's a mother's son and he doesn't want to grow up, and he's like a Peter Pan boy. And what Eros represents, or what Psyche sees, is not the Eros in front of her, the boy. She sees something else. She sees a love object. And Neumann calls this her second defloration. This does not abolish the matriarchal, he says, but raises it to the Amazonian level. She becomes an Amazon. She becomes active. And this leads inevitably to the loss of the lover. He is wounded and he leaves, and the encounter ends in separation. So that's where she's left at that moment. There you see Eros is revealed. They're looking at each other. And for the first time, she sees him, and probably he sees her clearly there too. Now, they're taking flight. This is a beautiful painting. Eros flying. She's hanging on while he's actually holding her, looks like, but he lets her go and she falls to the earth. And then Neumann says the Uroboric union is broken. What he talks about the Uroboric union, that in this state of unconsciousness that's in the Ouroboros, that's a snake that bites its own tail. It's an enclosed space in which there's no room to breathe. That kind of a union is broken, and separation follows. That's consciousness. Now the journey through suffering begins to overcome the separation and unite again on a conscious level. So the story isn't over with this separation. A union is proposed by Pan. He says, if you fight and struggle, you can win him back. So he gives her confidence and courage, and then she becomes a very active personality and sets out to achieve that goal. But it will be a union on a conscious level, not in the dark. And Neumann says this ends the age of the mythological and inaugurates the age of the human. So the mythological realm of the Ouroboros containment is over, and now the human begins, as it does in the Bible with the story of the expulsion from the garden. And he says that Psyche introduces a new love principle for consciousness and individuation rather than for procreation. It's a psychology of encounter. So what Aphrodite is all about is procreation. You fall in love for the purpose of having sex, and then you have babies, and then it's over, and you go on. So it's a psychology of procreation. What Psyche introduces is a psychology of consciousness, individuation, and conscious love. It remains to be seen if Psyche will prevail over Aphrodite and make the mother's boy, Eros, into a man, separating him from his mother. So that's going to be quite an achievement on her part if she can do that, Neumann says. Pan functions as a wisdom figure. He gives her struggle meaning. He says, win Eros. So sufferings and trials now take on meaning. That is, winning Eros back. No longer blind suffering with suicidal impulses. And besides, Psyche is pregnant. So her struggles have a meaning. There you see Psyche and Pan. And this meaningful struggle now is expressed in these 4 trials. The first trial of sorting seeds in the ants assist. Here, Neumann says Psyche counters Aphrodite's chaotic promiscuity and the masculine promiscuity of Eros with an instinctual ordering principle. This is an interesting idea. This is the only one of the 4 trials in which Aphrodite is not fully active. This is done for her. So Neumann says in her unconscious there is a spiritual principle at work that is it's an instinctual ordering principle that reaches the stage of selectivity. That is a kind of consciousness where selections are made, discriminations can be made. Rather than random scattering of seeds for fertility, which is the world of Eros and Aphrodite, to scatter the seeds as widely as you can, the love principle now becomes a selective instrument. So this is a stage in the development of Psyche's consciousness and the consciousness of the feminine, Neumann says, where the love principle becomes the paramount tool for making selections. And the ants represent this unconscious instinctual ordering principle in an early stage. They're at work in Psyche's unconscious, so she doesn't have to do very much. Our hero in the White Snake, in all 3 of his trials, is relatively passive. It's an interesting difference between the 2 fairy tales. In this one, Psyche is passive only in the first one. In the second, and third, and fourth, she's very active. She goes somewhere. She is helped, but she is an active player. Now, Psyche's individuation. The second trial. This is gathering the golden wool from the dangerous rams or solar animals. Neumann calls this the deadly masculine, facing the deadly masculine. And what he means by that is she's being asked to depotentiate or to engage with, in a very dangerous situation, the powerful energies of the negative masculine. Those are the rams. Or this could be equivalent to taming the animus, the masculine part of the feminine psyche. And what the reed comes along and teaches is patience. Go at the right time. Don't go too fast. Don't confront when you don't have a chance. It's a kind of wisdom that the reed teaches. So if you want to confront the raging masculine, whether it's inner or outer, it's better not to do it at noontime, you know. It's like if you have a raging temper, for instance, and it goes off, it's better not to try to deal with it in the moment. Go walk around the block Wait till the evening, let it cool off a little bit, and then see what can come of it. Because it can also have some value. These solar animals, these rams, have golden fleece. So sometimes from those aspects, those flare-ups, you get some good, value. And this has to do with relating to and integrating the animus, according to Neumann's interpretation. That what Psyche is doing in these trials is becoming a much stronger individual through engaging with the masculine energies and successfully dealing with them. She isn't overcome by them, and she doesn't get stuck. You can get stuck in any one of these trials and stay there, or lose your footing and be destroyed. So the first two deeds represent an erotic problem, Neumann says. Selectivity and patience are the lessons. And he sees Psyche as individuating, that she is developing the animus and she is developing her ego strength. Now, in Neumann's understanding, ego consciousness is masculine, and the unconscious is feminine. So what he sees Psyche doing is developing her consciousness, and that's what it means to develop her masculine side. She is developing an ego consciousness through these trials and tests over against a force that wants to keep her unconscious. That would be Aphrodite. Keep her in the unconscious, keep her in the great mother world. And she is gradually making her way out of it. Now, the third trial has to do with containing the powerful waters of life, what Neumann calls the uncontrollable masculine. This means giving form to life. She has to get this water and put it in a container and hold it in the container and not be destroyed by this project. So this is containing a tremendous amount of masculine energy and not being destroyed by it, not being overcome by it. And the eagle, who's the bird of Zeus, spiritual principle from above, shows sympathy and assistance, the masculine spirit opposing the hold of the great mother on Eros and on Psyche. So Zeus's sympathy with Psyche means that he's going against Aphrodite and against Aphrodite's influence on Eros. Aphrodite would keep Eros a little boy as long as possible. Psyche is integrating the masculine in these first three trials. Now comes the fourth trial. This is a very interesting one. According to Neumann, this is the essential one. The journey to the underworld, Persephone. And this is a direct struggle with the feminine principle because Persephone and Aphrodite are aligned. So Psyche has to go into the underworld and extract something and bring it back. And she has to use an active ego to do that. She's got it now after the first three trials. She is able actually to go into the underworld. Nobody goes there for her. The other, getting the golden fleece, the ego made the journey for her. Here she goes for herself. She is an active ego advised by a tower, which is a principle of consciousness, a man-made object, culture. And the tower helps her against her deadly enemies, Aphrodite. All the goddesses are against her. Aphrodite, Hera, Demeter, Persephone. She's up against all of them. And she has the help of Zeus. And in the previous episode with the eagle, and now she has the help of the tower. What the tower does is give her advice, how to go into the underworld, what to do when you see this figure and that figure, and how to get out again. So this is an initiation. It also requires that she ignores pity and what Neumann says, the distractions of relatedness. If she, because on her journey into the underworld, she sees these poor people calling out from the stream, help me, and another one on the shore, you know, I need your help. And if she would succumb to this, this distraction of relatedness, in other words, she has to ignore her feminine nature here, go against it, she would lose. She would get stuck in the underworld. She would never get out again. So this is a struggle against her feminine nature, according to Neumann's account. And she is successful. She actually makes the trip, she makes the journey, she comes out again. And there you see a picture of Psyche being carried by the boat of Charon across the river Styx into the underworld, either into or out of the underworld. You see the poor man grabbing onto the boat, calling for her help, and she has to refuse. So this final test, the beauty ointment, Neumann says this is the seduction of narcissism. Persephone's eternal youth. Persephone is always young, always beautiful. It's the temptation, the seduction of the barren, quotes, barren, frigid beauty of mere maidenhood, without love for a man as exacted by the matriarchate. So it's a regression back into the matriarchal world. Persephone, eternal youth, always beautiful, always a maiden, never a mother, never a wife, none of the complications of a woman's life, and so on. So this test is about regression to what Neumann says, becoming the maiden immured in narcissistic love of oneself as in a glass coffin, who sees only herself and whose womanhood slumbers. So that actually is what happens to Psyche when she opens it. She slumbers. There she opens the box of beauty secrets. But Neumann sees this failure in a very interesting way. He says the failure brings victory. And that is because if Psyche had not succumbed, the danger would be that she would get stuck in the animus world. She would get stuck in a kind of masculine consciousness, a sort of Amazon conquering ego consciousness. And she would lose contact completely with the feminine. She would have overcome the feminine, but now she would be out of touch with it. So he says, by preferring beauty to knowledge, she preferred beauty, she wanted beauty, that's a value of Aphrodite. She reunites herself with the feminine in her nature. So having established ego consciousness, she has to reunite herself with her base, because the feminine really is the base. The mother, the great mother, beauty over knowledge. So this is a renewal, he sees, of the bond to the feminine center, the self. So this, what actually looks like a failure of Aphrodite, she's successful in getting out of the underworld, but then she falls victim, but that is actually a key moment in her recovery of her feminine center. He says, a Psyche who fails, who for the sake of love renounces all principles, throws all warnings to the wind, and forsakes all reason, such a Psyche. And this is very dramatic language that Neumann is using, forsaking all reason, throwing all warnings to the wind, all principles. In other words, letting go of ego consciousness completely. Such a Psyche must ultimately find favor with Aphrodite, who assuredly recognizes a good part of herself in the new Aphrodite. So in a way, she's connecting to Aphrodite now, the great goddess and the mother of Eros, but in another way, having gone through the first three stages and made the development of a ego consciousness and an animus integration. And now Eros rescues her and brings her out of sleep, and she becomes divinized. And Neumann says about this divinization of Aphrodite, when Psyche is received into Olympus as the wife of Eros, an epoch-making development of the feminine and of all humanity is manifested in myth. So Neumann sees this story as a pivotal moment in the development of women's psychology and culture 2 millennia ago. And it's seen, he says, seen from the feminine standpoint, this signifies that the soul's individual ability to love is divine. So what Psyche represents now is a soul's individual ability, an individual choice to love is divine, and that transformation by love is a mystery that deifies. In other words, that elevates Psyche to the status of divinity, of a goddess. The human has conquered its place on Olympus, but this has been done not by a masculine deified hero, which would be the story of Hercules, for instance, who also becomes deified in the end, but through his a very different kind of overcoming of obstacles, in which he also has to integrate that feminine at one point, but by a loving soul. This has been done not by a masculine deified hero, but by a loving soul, that's Psyche. So she's the hero, the heroine of the story. Human womanhood as an individual has mounted to Olympus, and this human womanhood as an individual is what Neumann wants to lift up as the goal of individuation for all women, not just in the ancient world or whatever, but also in the modern world, and including in the feminist and post-feminist world, Neumann would say. This reconnection with the feminine after having achieved a very strong animus position is absolutely essential for this final result of the individuation process, human womanhood as an individual, with full womanly capacities and accomplishments, including motherhood, because Psyche will now give birth to her child. Pleasure. This is the wedding of Psyche and Eros being celebrated on Olympus. Now, before we stop, I just wanted to give Neumann's conclusion and then also share with you a different view by von Franz and then a statement by Hillman. Neumann says, through her ascension to Olympus, she demonstrates that a new epoch has begun. That Psyche has become a goddess means that the human is itself divine and equal to the gods. This is being raised up into the divine realm. And the eternal union of the goddess Psyche with the god Eros means that the human bond with the divine is not only eternal, but itself of a divine quality. So what he's saying is that what the story teaches us is that the achievement of Psyche to overcome all these obstacles in the name of Eros, in the name of love, individual choice of Eros as her love object and seeing through all these trials and tribulations, elevates the value of that orientation to the archetypal. It makes it divine. It valorizes it. It gives it the highest value. So he wants to set the value of the human bond formed out of individual love at the pinnacle of human and cultural values. That's Neumann's. Now, I'm not going to go into this. These are stages of feminine development, which are more or less spoken of earlier. Von Franz has a different view. She says, at the end of the story, everything has returned into the collective unconscious from which it came. Just as the boy's savior in the apocalypse returned to the beyond, which implies that a realization in consciousness was not yet possible. So she's looking at the story in a historical perspective, 2 millennia ago, 2,000 years ago. It was not yet possible. It was a kind of intuition of some possibilities, but in the concrete world, as it existed in those patriarchal times, it was not possible. It was a dream. Everything happens in the beyond without being understood, she says. Yet it exists somewhere. In fact, it even has an invisible positive effect. So what von Franz would say is that it took 2,000 years, maybe until the 20th, 21st century, for this development within the feminine and within culture, the appreciation of the values that are represented by Psyche, to actually become a feature, a possible feature of culture, post-patriarchal culture. That culture will change and grow out of its patriarchal heritage, just as the patriarchy grew out of its matriarchal background before that. Now, Hillman says an interesting thing. He comments on this in his book, The Myth of Analysis. And he doesn't say very much about the story of Umar and Psyche itself. But he does say that Jungians can't keep their hands off of it. It's such a fascinating story. And he does appreciate Neumann's analysis of it and his interpretation. But Hillman wants to say something about the possibilities of a transformation in therapy and in the project of Jungian psychoanalysis. He says, quotes, "To meet the new problems in the analysis of today," he's writing this in around 1970, by the way, "we need a new myth. The tale of Eros and Psyche has advantages over its predecessors." So he wants to use the tale of Eros and Psyche as a myth for analysis. Advantages over its predecessors, for although the other myths are not wrong, they are but predecessors. We must see the success of central myths in psychology as portraying a movement of consciousness. The shift in the great classical themes from Oedipus, that's Freud, and the hero, that's Jung, to Eros and Psyche, that would be contemporary, provides a description by means of metaphor for the archetypal change taking place in the psyche and its field psychology. And in his book, he attempts to lay out some of the features of what this new myth for analysis would be. The myth of analysis being the myth of Eros and Psyche would have much more to do with the feminine values, let's say, and relationship and relatedness than overcoming problems, obstacles in a heroic way, or solving riddles, the riddle of the unconscious, which was Freud's project, that it has to do with process and relationship and relatedness. And I think this was a very correct estimation of where the field was at that time in 1970. And I think since then, if you read books in Jungian analysis, and certainly the whole development of the field of relational analysis, has proven that this story of Eros and Psyche would be a fitting mythical basis for that kind of relational work, because the story is really all about relationship and the developing of a particular kind of relationship out of the collective forms that are offered by the matriarchy, where the man is simply a means for getting pregnant, or the patriarchy, where the woman is there only to serve the man, into another configuration where relationships are individual, they might be idiosyncratic, they might be unusual, but they're based on individual selection and on choices that are not easy and are not without their obstacles and problems. As we saw in the case of Psyche, there are many forces going against her, including Aphrodite, including the undeveloped Eros, including her sisters, and yet in the end, she manages to achieve an individual relationship to the man that she first knew in the dark and then saw in the light, and came into a very different kind of relationship with him as a result. So I think that will be our seminar for today. Our time is up, I believe. Ryan, am I correct?
Yes, that is correct. Another astonishing webinar, Maria. We can't thank you enough. I'm sure everyone is clapping from home. I was just saying, I'm sure everyone is clapping from home, Murray. It was another excellent webinar. It's hard to believe that we're already 3 sessions into the fairy tale seminar series, but we will have the next one in 2 weeks, everyone, on the 15th. It will be led by John Hill. Murray, are you going to join us
Yes,
Morning.
I'll join you. I'll be there, probably silent, but I'll be there. Yeah.
Very nice to hear. All right. Well, thank you so much for everything, Murray.
Okay.
Really, this has been another just excellent series of seminars, and we can't thank you enough for doing them with us.
Thanks, Ryan.
And with that, I'll let everyone get back to your weekends. Murray, have a wonderful Saturday and Sunday, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.